buenas tardes, good afternoon. My name is Cindy Benavides, and I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. For many Latinos living in the United States, the devastating effects of warming planet are already here. We have seen it with farm workers picking up our food while wildfires ravage California and the northwest of our country. We have seen it when millions of Puerto Ricans were displaced from their homes after Hurricane Maria. And we have seen it in Texas, where a storm made temperature drop precipitously in a matter of hours. And we know that this is just the beginning. As the longest and largest serving Latino organization in the country, to ignore these facts would be a disservice to our community and our country, as well as our world. The mission of the League of United Latin American Citizens is to advance the economic condition, educational attainment, political influence, housing, health, and civil rights of the Hispanic community in the United States. I am so thrilled to be here with you as we talk about climate action from the lens of our Latino community. We have experts who will be talking at length with our moderator, Vanessa Hawk, in terms of what more can we be doing in the community to make sure that this administration is keeping in mind what is top of mind for us. It is my absolute honor to convene such an important conversation alongside our partners, the Environmental Defense Fund, also known as EDF, Green Latinos, Corazon Latino, Hispanic Access Foundation, Hispanic Federation, Eco Madres, and CHCI, to help make sure that we continue to uplift the climate platform and put our community at front and center. A big thank you to Cynthia and Esther for all their hard work in organizing this event today. It is my pleasure to turn this over to Vanessa Hawk, who will be moderating this panel. Vanessa is an Emmy Award-winning journalist and the anchor of Noticias Telemundo Fin de Semana, the weekend newscast, which airs Saturdays and Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern and 5:30 p.m. Central Time. Vanessa is also a co-founder of Sacha Mama, or Mother Jungle, a nonprofit organization that works to inspire, empower, and educate the Latino community on climate issues and sustainable attitudes, behaviors, and lifestyle. Vanessa, it is such a pleasure to have you here today with us. And thank you so much for moderating this important discussion with Dr. Cecilia Martinez, Tomás Carbonell, and Dr. Gerald Torres. Con eso te lo paso a ti. Thank you.
Gracias, Cindy. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Bienvenidos. I'm just really happy to be here. And I want to thank our partners for hosting this very important conversation. And I want to also welcome our live audience. Thank you for joining us. We have a star group of panelists that will be bringing light to where we are in the climate crisis, how it's affecting specifically Latinos, and how we can move forward, leaving no one behind. So I want to invite you to join this conversation. Please send us your questions for our panelists, and at the end of this conversation, we're going to ask them your questions. To begin with, I think it's very important to acknowledge that it's wonderful that our country is on the road to recovering from COVID-19. Tomorrow would mark exactly a year since the OMS declared a global pandemic. And for all of us, it's been a very challenging, a very difficult year, to say the least. But it's been also a year that has brought us many lessons. Today is evident that we have a seriously damaged relationship with nature, and that this relationship needs to be addressed and ultimately needs to be restored and bring harmony and balance. We know also that the loss of biodiversity opened the doors for new epidemics, and we need to change this. And we also realize that the pandemic is affecting everyone, but it's not affecting everyone equally. Usually the most vulnerable communities are paying the highest price. Latinos and other people of color are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And the same is true when we talk about the climate crisis. Most Latinos live in the 3 states that are experiencing the most serious effects related to climate change: historic droughts and wildfires in California, record-breaking heat and power outages in Texas, and increased sea level rise and flooding in Florida. Latinos are also more likely to live in counties that have unhealthy levels of ozone. And so it's very important that we address all these issues. So where do we go from here? And how do we implement sustainable lifestyles where no one is left behind? To answer these questions, I will invite to the conversation this amazing group of panelists. So first, please welcome Dr. Cecilia Martinez. She is the Senior Director for Environmental Justice in President Biden's White House Council on Environmental Quality. So welcome, Dr. Cecilia. We also have with us Mr. Tomás Carbonell. He is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Stationary Sources in the Office of Air and Radiation at the Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome, Mr. Carbonell. And also we have with us Dr. Gerard Torres. He is a Professor of Environmental Justice at the Yale School of Environment. So welcome, Dr. Torres. It's great to have you with us. We are just delighted to be with all of you. So my first question is for all of you. So I would like your thoughts on where we are now and how do you feel about these moments in terms of the environmental work? Dr. Martinez.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's really a privilege and honor to be here, especially with these distinguished guests. So your first question is probably on point in terms of where we are in a historic moment in this country. I think one of the things that we have seen over time is that the environmental justice movement has persevered. It has continued to struggle to make a national agenda to front and center, to be an important element and component on a national, not just climate agenda, but also environmental agenda. And where we are at this moment is that we are seeing environmental justice finally is being a center focal point of environmental and climate policy, both in the administration, but also in Congress as well, which is critical for all of us. I think one of the things that all our communities know and understand is they have been disproportionately bearing the cost of economic development and wealth by being the most overburdened communities and having the least access to resources to deal with those pollution burdens, which impact public health, which impact the future of our families and our children's safety. And so I think we are at a critical moment where we can garner both community support, community movements that have brought us to this stage, but also bring science and policy to address these fundamental and critical problems that we need to address for not only for our human communities, but also for Mother Earth and the planet.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez. Mr. Carbonell?
I just wanted to say that I'm also very grateful to have the opportunity to join this conversation and to speak with you and to thank so many of you for the work that you do to advocate for strong climate protections, protect public health, and ensure that communities that have suffered disproportionately from the burdens of pollution for far too long have access to clean and healthy air and a safe climate. I couldn't agree more with Cecilia that we really are at a historic moment in which we have, an administration that has placed climate progress, protecting public health, and elevating environmental justice really at the center of its agenda and the top of its priorities in a really historic and unprecedented way. And I think, for those of us serving in the federal government, we have an opportunity to deploy a broad range of tools. And speaking just from the EPA perspective and the Office of Air and Radiation perspective, that includes Clean Air Act regulatory protections, but it also goes beyond that to include tools like voluntary partnerships, grant opportunities, public engagement, pollution monitoring and enforcement to achieve reductions on a multi-pollutant basis that address the climate crisis and that improve public health at the same time. And to do that in a way that achieves concrete benefits for communities that are disproportionately affected by air pollution and climate impacts. And I believe that the only way to achieve those goals and to deliver on EPA's founding promise of securing a safe and healthy environment for everyone in our country is to undertake authentic engagement with communities and to work in partnership with them as we carry out that agenda. And I think Vanessa, you and Cindy did a really great job of highlighting the really high stakes that Latino communities have, the vital stakes in this work. As we all recognize, the impacts of climate change will fall hardest on vulnerable communities. EPA itself has published analysis that went into the fourth national climate assessment that documented some of the health and economic impacts of climate change, including heat waves, sea level rise, and extreme weather, all of which will have particularly important impacts for Latino communities. And then of course, Latino communities also disproportionately suffer from air quality and air pollution, which in many cases stems from some of the same sources that are driving climate change. So that just underscores that we have real opportunities to tackle all these problems at the same time. And I think the leadership that the administration and the president have already shown through executive orders that are helping organize some of our early work are really, helping create space and opportunity to make progress on these issues.
Definitely, Mr. Carbonell. And I think from the EPA perspective, you have a monumental task in front of you to work on working on all those measures that were reversed by the past administration. I think more than 96 different laws to protect people and the environment were reversed in the past 4 years. So I know that you have a lot of work to do. Thank you so much. Dr. Torres?
Thank you for having me today. And I'm honored to sit on the panel with people who are in the trenches and doing the work, right? So I suspect that this moment on the panel for them feels like a little relief from having to put their shoulder to the wheel. And so let me just say I thank you for having been in government. I know that it's you stock up on your sleep and then you catch up later, right? So I appreciate that. I'm going to say a couple of things that make me, or that suggest that we're in a new moment, right? I have to say I've been involved in environmental justice for a long time. So when I was in the Clinton administration, I had the principal drafting authority for the executive order on environmental justice. And then you have some congressional proponents like Senator Booker, who have suggested codifying the executive order into statutes to get it moving, which would be great. And I can come back and talk about that later. But I have to say, and I hope it doesn't make me sound like a sap, right? But hearing the president say the words environmental justice is a signal moment. I mean, that it's so important because it means is that issue is right at the top, right? The rest of the administration takes their lead from what the president does. And if the president says that justice and environmental justice is going to be central, and I think the whole government approach that the president has outlined is critical. So that means justice and environmental justice is going to be the lens through which all of the programs are considered. It's not going to be an add-on. It's not going to be something that is considered after the decisions have been made, but it's going to be one of the things through which you drive the decisions. And I think that's really critical. Now, the executive orders that the president's already issued, and I'd love to get maybe the other panelists can give me some insight, and I'll run and tell people. But the 40% for justice, or 40% for equity in the benefits. When President Biden laid that out as a goal to be achieved, I mean, I was very optimistic. But we're going to need metrics, right, to be able to assess whether that goal is being achieved. And so the development of those metrics is going to be critical. One last thing, I remember speaking to Green Latinos, one of the sponsors of this, once, and if you look at the data, there's a couple of things that are true. One is the most loyal Green voters historically are Latinos. So across all demographic groups, the most loyal Green voters are Latinos. So that if you're not registering voters, you're not doing environmental work. And I want to underline that. So, that's part of our task.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. You are absolutely right. And I think it has to do with the fact that we have a very strong connection with our planet. It's something that runs in our DNA, in our blood. We have this connection with our Madre Tierra, and it's very important for us, but also that we are one of the most affected communities. So that's also the case. Okay, so what can history of environmental injustice teach us, and what can we do better, and what is urgent right now, Dr. Martinez?
Well, I think, building of what Mr. Carbonell and Dr. Torres have said, look, environmental justice didn't just happen today. It didn't just happen with announcements and proclamations today. We know, but they are, as Dr. Torres said, incredibly important, historic, symbolic, and mark a new era in environmental policy and in the environmental movement, to be quite honest, because we know historically that there has been tensions and conflicts. We know that the environmental movement and the environmental justice movement have not always seen eye to eye on how to move forward on this country's environmental issues and agendas. And we're seeing more and more that we are better understanding that we cannot continue to do environmental policy, environmental regulation without paying particular attention to the distribution of who benefits and who loses, who bears the costs of environmental regulation or lack of environmental regulation, and who benefits. And I think that, I'm often asked, how does the environmental justice movement see climate change? And I often return the question of saying, well, tell me when you think the onset of climate change happened. What is the origins and beginnings of climate change? And we often hear, well, it was, the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the fossil fuel industry, et cetera. But if you are communities of color and indigenous communities, we can say that the advent of climate change in terms of the changing of our ecosystem in North America can be seen as potentially a beginning of climate change. And the intersection of the kinds of policies, whether they were agricultural policies or clear-cut clearing of our virgin forests that now we use to sequester carbon. And we cannot deny that there were racial implications with many of the kinds of past, both agricultural and environmental policies, urban policies that have created a situation where we have become very fossil fuel dependent, that we have had not only greenhouse gas emissions, but also very harmful co-pollutants, as you mentioned, particulate matter. And so what we can learn from the environmental justice movement is the reality of how our economic system impacts our communities. They are, and I hate to use the phrase because it's been overused, but it's absolutely true. They are the canaries in the mine. They are the ones that first experience the impacts. They are the ones that know what these impacts are. They are the ones that have the most intimate knowledge about what the impacts of our society and our policies are doing. And I think what we can learn is that environmental justice movement has always said that what we need and what we want, what environmental justice means is a healthy environment where we live, where we work, where we play, where we pray, and where we go to school. And it can't be any more intersectional than that. That is the lesson that they have taught. And I think that, as Dr. Torres has said, is the lesson that now the Biden administration is taken to heart. When we talk about a whole of government approach to environmental justice, it does mean environmental regulation. It does mean EPA, and it means DOE. How do we create better and sustainable energy system? And what are the distributional benefits and costs of that? It means HHS. It means public health and how our communities will fare in terms of their health. It means HUD. It means affordable housing, but sustainable, safe housing that all communities can access in neighborhoods that are not overburdened and overpolluted. It means transportation, so it means DOT. It means climate resilience, so it means FEMA. That's what it means to have a whole of government approach to environmental justice. But I would not want to lose the lesson that that has been the environmental justice movement's mantra since its origins, that it is all of those things. And I'm just really excited for the work that is ahead to try and hopefully make that happen.
Yes, absolutely, Dr. Martinez. I mean, everything is interconnected, and that's why it's very important that we take this multidisciplinary approach. Dr. Torres, what can we do better this time?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. One is, you know, we're recovering right now, right, from lack of attention to this over the last 4 years, and so that's gonna occupy a lot of energy, but it's not gonna, I think, push us away from moving forward. I mean, one of the things that Dr. Martinez said, you know, which is really critical, because it's something you learn when you talk to the communities. You talk to the environmental justice advocates, you talk to the people in these environmental justice communities. They will list things that kind of mainstream environmentalists historically had not thought of as environmental issues, like the capacity of public transportation to get you to a hospital if you need it. Right? That's a public health issue. It's also a transportation issue. It is something that environmental justice advocates say, look, we have to pay attention to that. Lack of bus shelters. You don't think of that as a public health issue. But in places like Texas, where I used to live, where it gets hot, right? If you can't get out of the sun while you're waiting for public transportation, that's a public health issue. And so you go down the list. And I think, you know, I think the reason the whole government approach matters is we have to focus on transportation is going to be critical. I absolutely think transportation is going to be critical. There is what the environmental justice movements call a just transition. So we know we have to move to a non-carbon based energy system, non-fossil fuel based energy systems. We know that that's going to have an impact on the economy in varieties of ways. What we have to be sure is that that process doesn't exacerbate the inequalities that already exist, but in fact addresses those inequalities right at the beginning. So one thing I would like to suggest is that we expand the public health lens. And so we ask, how do these things that we think of as just environmental issues really have a broader impact on the public health? Or put a different way, how do we take these things that we think of as public health issues and see them as environmental issues? One last example, and then I'll be quiet. A friend of mine, Robert Garcia, has passed away. One of his tasks, and it almost seems quixotic, right, was to regreen the LA River, right? Now, you have a place like LA, which is relatively park poor, but but parks shouldn't be thought of as just amenities. What you realize is when you have trees and green in cities, it reduces particulate matter, which then improves the respiratory health. The latest data shows it actually improves mental health, being able to have access to green spaces and more green in your communities. These, you know, perhaps weren't thought of as environmental issues, but they are environmental issues, and they're tied to public health. And so making that link, I think, is going to be critical.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. I think it's critical what you just said, because it's a very delicate balance. But it's, I mean, as we saw it in the COVID-19 crisis, how the areas that were more polluted, the people that lives in those areas, many of them Latinos and African Americans, were the most affected by respiratory diseases, and they die more likely than other people, and they recover. I mean, they were not so fast recovery as other patients. So this has I mean, public health has to be involved in everything. But now my question, Mr. Carbonell, is how do we know? Because Dr. Toro was explaining us that many things that we might think about that they are environmental justice maybe the federal government doesn't have the view of what the people and the communities are feeling. So how do we make sure that we are in touch with these communities to know what they need, or to know what is affecting them when we talk about environmental?
It's a really important question, and it's it's one that we're grappling with in real time at EPA, and I'm sure it's a problem that other agencies are grappling with as well. And I think it just really goes to just to build on a really important point that both Dr. Martinez and Dr. Torres raised. Just goes to the kind of deep-rooted, multifaceted dimensions of environmental injustice and the legacy of disproportionate impacts that we're seeing. It really requires a concerted and multifaceted effort to try to address those challenges. And so the whole of government approach is part of that. The presidential leadership from the top and making that work is part of that. And I also believe that listening to and engaging with communities, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, is a really important piece of ensuring that as we make decisions, as we implement policies, we're being responsive to the lived reality of these impacts on the ground for communities. And I'll just underscore that there's a variety of ways in which engagement can happen. And actually, EPA in the past has done some really great work to engage with communities and to actually fold that into and reflect community needs. One example from the Obama administration was a rule addressing air pollution from refineries, where there was early outreach to fence line communities near refineries that identified a need for rigorous monitoring of pollution at these facilities. And that input actually kind of helped shape a rule that required rigorous fence line monitoring at petroleum refineries. I think that's just an example of how listening to communities and engaging them early in a process appropriately can really help shape good outcomes. And as EPA moves forward with both regulatory decisions and then other policy actions, there's really a variety of forums that ranging from participating in public comments, public meetings, webinars, hearings, as well as informal meetings with policymakers where that kind of engagement can happen. And I think to me, like the imperative and the challenge that we face is finding ways to engage communities early, to do it often, and to do it in a way that's accessible and fair and respectful. And so I think that's a continuous project for us, and those are the goals that we should aspire to.
Thank you so much, Mr. Carbonell. Dr. Martinez, what are we doing today to protect frontline communities, or are we doing anything at all? I mean, is there a plan laid out for these communities?
Yeah, so there's a few things. One, several of which I think we've already talked about. First of all, I think we need to recognize and meet head on the complexity of this problem. That what we have is both a regulatory system that hasn't always been as effective and successful in terms of meeting the needs of the most vulnerable communities. And so what does it mean to systemically change that regulatory system? How do we make it, for example, the key word in environmental justice communities is cumulative impacts. We do not have a system currently that either can monitor, as Dr. Torres has said, and Mr. Carbonell, that it can monitor the cumulative health impacts of multiple sources of emissions and multiple contaminants on a particular community, nor do we have an effective way to regulate those in a way that can maximize public health and safety. Those are deep-seated institutional things that we need to get to work on and figure out how to do. I think that is something that we are doing in the Biden administration because the Council of Environmental Quality is now the White House coordinator and convener both of the EJ Interagency Council, as well as the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is the community stakeholders council to advise. We are really trying to sync up what are these major issues and what are the major systemic changes that need to happen and what are the potential steps that we can take to make that happen. This is not going to be easy. It's not going to happen in 1 year, but there is a race to make sure that we do it quickly in order to meet the public health needs of our communities so they don't suffer, continue to suffer the negative health impacts that they have been suffering. But in addition, it has to be strategic and thoughtful. We do not want to institute policies or institute systems that are not going to be effective. We want to be able to, for example, as Dr. Torres mentioned, make sure that we institute performance metrics. That's part of the Biden administration's plan. Instituting EJ scorecards that would be published annually, that would establish metrics. How are our agencies in our federal government doing with respect to environmental justice communities? It includes developing new tools, like making the EJ screening tool that is now in place, that EPA invested an enormous amount of time with very limited resources to get up and running, but now needs to be expanded upon, made more robust, and be a tool that can help us identify what are the key vulnerabilities that environmental justice communities are facing, and how can we identify those priorities and leverage agency, federal agency resources to meet the need. So those two things are connected. We don't just pump out money, but we pump out money for purpose. We pump out money to address the strategic problems that communities are facing. And I think together as a package, as we talk about a whole of government approach to environmental justice, it means all of those things. It means getting science better at understanding. We need to invest in the knowledge industry of understanding what and how our communities are being impacted. It means also developing the right tools, the decision-making tools that can help our agencies make sure to address those issues. It means developing metrics, so there's constant monitoring, evaluation, and benchmarking, so we can come back and change things when they are not working. And just as importantly as all of those things, it means effective and meaningful involvement of EJ communities themselves in the processes of decision-making. We have had, EPA has done a great job in that, so have some of the other agencies, but we can do better and we should do better. And we should have the community be able to know that they are an accepted part and have input into the decision-making that we continue to engage in.
Thank you, Dr. Martinez. I mean, definitely this is a plan that has to be, as you say, it's not from one day to the other, because it's very complex. The important thing is that we begin right now, because we are really running out of time, and these effects are going to be felt today and tomorrow, and we're seeing it today already. Okay, so Dr. Torres, what are the priority environmental justice areas, and how do they relate to the Latino community?
I wish I could say there was, this is the first priority generally, but the points that Dr. Martinez and Mr. Carbonell were making are critical, which is the challenges facing the communities are going to be different. So one priority, I think, would be a vigorous enforcement of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And that means that all of the communities, here I'm thinking of the communities in South Texas because they're the ones I am familiar with. Vigorous enforcement of the Safe Drinking Water Act does a couple things. One, it will require investment, but it'll require investment that will actually pay long-term dividends, bringing safe drinking water to communities. And Texas is currently is of course facing this in multiple challenges. Will improve public health generally. In cities where air pollution, and Mr. Carbonell could perhaps talk about this more specifically than I, the challenges of air pollution have to be up there in terms of priorities, identifying those communities that are most affected by the different kinds of air pollution, because the actual sources of the air pollution means that the problem that the communities are facing are going to be different. Now in California, you have a problem that may be, impossible to get your hands around, because over the last few years, right, the biggest contribution to poor air quality has been particulate matter from the fires. Right, so that means one of the priorities has got to be better management of the forests in order to reduce the prevalence of fires while California is facing another drought. Recognizing that if you control the fires, you're also doing something for air. Okay, and so the Clean Air Act is not a good tool for that. So that means you've got to work with Interior, you've got to work with Department of Agriculture, you've got to work with CAL FIRE, you've got to work with the state agencies. And so you go around the country, and the priorities are going to look slightly different. But if you use, in my view, a public health lens, it'll help you identify what the priorities ought to be from one area to the next. One of the heat impact is something that doesn't get enough attention, but in fact, more people die of heat in this country than die of cold, right? And I've lived in Minnesota. I can tell you it gets cold, right? But controlling the impact of heat in urban areas is going to involve HHS, it's going to involve HUD, it's going to involve a lot of different agencies, some of which you don't think of as environmental agencies. But that's why the whole government approach really matters. So if you use the public health lens, you're going to identify priorities that will look different from place to place, but where you're looking at cumulative impacts. What you're going to do is you're going to have to require the agencies that manage these different, the sources of these different impacts, and have them working hand in glove, have them working consistently and not at cross purposes. So it's a big task, right? But I think the government right now is thinking about it in the correct way. And if we can just get the pieces in place so that the agencies start to act consistent with that vision, I think we'll be in I'm not gonna say we're gonna be in good shape right away, but we'll be in the position to be in good shape. Underline all of it, and then I'll shut up, is making sure that there is meaningful community participation at all levels, right? Because that's what democracy means.
Totally. And there's nobody that knows better what they need than the community. Thank you, Dr. Torres. We just did a story about that not long ago in Noticias Telemundo in Planeta Tierra about how our community, Latino community, were more impacted by asthma. I mean, their children have 40% more likely to suffer from asthma or to die from asthma than children from any other ethnic group. And it's because of the areas that they live in many cities in our country. And so my question to you, Mr. Carbonell, is, okay, so how do you tackle that? I mean, if we talk about practical, specific measures that you can take besides, of course, getting better with their quality, what you can do with these families that are already suffering because their children are sick with asthma?
Thanks, Vanessa. And you highlight just a really, tragic and pressing problem that is part of this broader environmental justice challenge that the president and the administration are committed to addressing. And I want to say it's still, very early days in the administration, and we are really looking forward here at EPA to Secretary Michael Regan being confirmed as administrator and benefiting from the direction and guidance that he will provide. But as I've mentioned, EPA has already received really firm direction from the president in the form of executive orders to place environmental justice at the center of our work and to take bold action on climate and public health. And EPA staff are really energized to meet those goals. To answer your question, there's really kind of a broad toolkit and a broad set of measures that EPA can draw on in addressing inequities and urgent public health and climate threats facing Latino communities. Part of that, an important piece of that, is the regulatory toolkit, and pursuant to an executive order that President Biden issued on January 20th, his first day in office. EPA is already reviewing past actions related to climate and air quality that were issued by the previous administration, including in key areas like emission standards for oil and gas facilities and for vehicles, and considering further action on those. Looking beyond that, EPA under the Clean Air Act has the ability to set ambient air quality standards to protect public health, to address hazardous air pollutant emissions from sources across the economy. And so that's an important portfolio to be mindful of and to think about as we tackle these public health threats. Looking beyond that, though, I just want to emphasize that there's a whole range of other work that EPA does that can really help make progress on problems like ozone and asthma exacerbation. Just one example is voluntary partnerships and programs that EPA undertakes. For example, EPA has for many years operated a very successful partnership with ports, and port communities are often very heavily affected by particulate pollution, air toxics pollution from a variety of sources. And I think the experience that we've had, working with communities near ports and with state and local governments to address, port pollution problems is just an example that we can build on, demonstrating that there's a range of sort of non-regulatory approaches that can be really effective in addressing these issues. I hope that helps address.
Yes.
I'd like to add a point because Mr. Carbonell, mentioned ports. Well, one of the impacts, of course, of COVID is the increased pollution because of the disruption at the ports. So those communities which were already impacted when everything was running smoothly, right? When everything was running perfectly smoothly, they were still suffering a disproportionate impact. Now that things are not running smoothly, the impacts are multiplied. And what COVID did is it pulled the curtain back on the inequalities in public health. And so I mean, Mr. Carbonell put his finger exactly on that point, and I think it's really important.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Dr. Martinez, the Biden administration announced that 40% of climate and environmental investments will be directed towards frontline and vulnerable communities. What does this mean for the Latino community?
Well, I think it means it means that for the first time, we are looking at providing a massive amount of federal funding and federal investments directly targeted to prioritize communities for exactly the reason, everything that we've been talking about here. Mm-hmm. I will say there has been some questions about what's the difference between 40% investment and 40% investment benefits. And I think, that has confused some folks, and I want to try and unpack that a little bit because I think it's a critically important piece. So, for example, if there is investment in a new water treatment facility or a new water sewer system, it may not mean that that particular system would be directly in that community, correct? So the investment wouldn't go directly to that community, but the benefit to that community in terms of having safe drinking water, and other important healthcare and health facilities would be there. And so I think the reason that the term 40% investment benefits was developed was to ensure that the communities themselves actually receive the benefits of those investments, whether it's in clean transportation, which will also definitely have to include affordable transportation, access to transportation, but also, as we know, transportation is a critical pollution issue in environmental justice communities. How can we prioritize investment benefits that will produce both accessible, affordable, and pollution reduction transportation access for these communities? And we see that as Mr. Carbonell has said and Dr. Torres, in EJ communities with respect to ports and the goods movement. That the incredible amount of air quality issues that go along with the goods movement system, we need to address the transport and low emissions transportation in these areas because our communities will benefit from that. Similarly, in clean energy, we need to invest in energy systems that will reduce both the co-pollutants that go along with fossil fuel emissions, but also greenhouse gas emissions, which are a global pollutant. So investing in renewable energy that may not be directly cited in these communities, but our communities will receive the benefits from them by increased air quality, will be critically important. And I think one of the most important lessons that I'm learning as I'm doing this job is that we need to figure out how to work together in an aligned way that benefits both our communities that have been left out, that have been marginalized in the past economy, but also work with our friends and colleagues and brothers and sisters who are currently working, whose livelihood depends on the fossil fuel industry. Because I think the last thing in terms of environmental justice as a principle, as a movement, is that our communities benefit to the detriment of other communities. The idea of environmental justice has always been that we lift all boats, that we provide ideas and solutions that will benefit everyone, and that we are not simply transferring the pollution burden or the economic burden to other communities. That's what justice has meant for environmental justice in the environmental justice movement. And I think our task ahead is to continue to advance those kinds of principles and build relationships and alignment about how we can work together to achieve these outcomes, both for workers, fence line communities, and workers who are in these facilities have the exact same health issues, have the exact same economic issues sometimes. And I have seen when they come together, how much more powerful the movement can be in achieving solutions for everyone.
Definitely, Dr. Martinez. Thank you so much for bringing that issue up, because that was exactly my next question. We know that we need to decarbonize the economy by phasing out fossil fuels, but the idea is not to let anyone behind. So what is the plan for these workers that have been basically energizing our planet for the past 100 years? What do you have for them?
I think that's where this whole of government approach, I'll just take a really quick stab and then turn it over. So in addition to the EJ initiatives that the president has put forward, this whole of government EJ approach, there are also initiatives that we're intersecting, for example, an interagency working group on coal and power plant communities. The idea, of course, is that all of these is intersected. So what kind of investments do we need, not both to reduce emissions, to enhance sustainability of our most vulnerable, overburdened communities, but also that are job creating. The linkage between transitioning, the just transition that has been mentioned before, is not that we would go back in economic development, but that we would move forward. And the opportunities for jobs and the economy and transitioning to this new economy are there for our taking. And we need to create the pathways to achieve that, both for the workers and for people who have been marginalized in the past economic.
Great. Dr. Torres or Mr. Carbonell, would you like to add something to this?
Well, I want to underline all that, but one of both the difficulties and potential opportunities of facing this administration is, as you design and build out a just transition, you're doing it in the context of this grave crisis that we're in the middle of. On the other hand, if you're going to rebuild the economy, you don't want to just rebuild it the way it was, right? You want to rebuild the economy so that it's facing forward, and that's going to be making sure we do that correctly can address some of the social issues that Dr. Martinez was talking about in relationship to job transition, et cetera. So the infrastructure build out, the climate conservation core idea that's been floated about, all of these are ways you can invest in building a workforce for the future, building an economy for the future. That's why, and I'm going to be I'm not harp on this. That's why getting those metrics in a way that are understandable in terms of investment or investment benefits is going to be absolutely critical, and it's going to be critical for the communities to understand what that means, right? I mean, I'd like to say we're taking your word for it, but we want to see what you do, right?
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Mr. Carbonell?
I thought Dr. Torres and Dr. Martinez both made excellent points and don't have much to add except just to highlight that I think one of the real kind of breakthroughs and contributions that the president and the administration have made in this space is to recognize that progress on climate, progress on public health, progress on environmental justice means leaving no community behind, including communities that have traditionally relied on the fossil fuel economy. And I think there's been a recognition reflected in the Building Back Better initiative and and other actions that the president has taken that we need to find solutions for all communities, make concrete investments, and a recognition that in the climate space there's a lot of potential for kind of win-win arrangements where clean energy can create jobs and be an engine of economic revival, and not just sort of environmental policy standing in isolation. So.
Definitely, thank you, Mr. Cornell. Now I would like to share a couple of questions from our live audience. So the first question says, how is this administration working to rectify some of the historical injustices that we just mentioned? Dr. Martinez?
I think I think it's happening in many, many ways. I think first, elevating environmental justice to a White House, as we've already mentioned, to a White House all-inclusive, whole of government approach is one. I don't want to underestimate, and my friends and colleagues who are in government know this much better and have been in government know this much better than I, but elevating the EJ to the White House level is a significant move in the sense that it brings the power of the executive offices of the president to bear. So in terms of that, that's one particular. In terms of the other things that we've been talking about, I think, Mr. Carbonell can talk a lot more about. I understand EPA is moving fast and furiously in terms of trying to figure out how to deal with environmental justice, how to build out its environmental justice regulatory program, et cetera. So I am seeing being able to be in this whole of government approach and be able to be in the conversations, cross-agency conversations. I can tell you that it is always front and center in any meeting that I'm at. The questions are pointed. The questions are, what are you doing? And please bring us back the information of what progress you are making to address equity and environmental justice in your planning and in your strategies. So I think it's all happening. It's also, we know that according with the executive order, there are several things that will have to be in place by this summer. One of those is how the new climate and economic justice screening tool is going to be improved. So you will see the plan on how to improve these screening tools. There will have to be sort of recommendations to the Interagency Council on the investment benefits, on Justice 40. So very quickly in the first 6 months, the goal is to have some concrete plans and some concrete strategies about how we might be able to move forward to address these historic issues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez. Dr. Torres, a question for you. What can Latinos do to make sure this administration does not forget about our communities?
Well, the first thing is to remind them again and again of the important political base that we represent across the country. And when I look at California, Texas, and Florida, the Latino electorate, the potential Latino electorate, if we can get mobilized, right, it is actually very strong. And we also need to remind them of the point that I made right at the beginning, which is the data indicates that in terms of green voters, Latinos are the most loyal green voters. So if this administration wants to build support in the Latino community, then committing to environmental justice that actually shows results in the Latino community will solidify and underline its support, and the Latino community environmental justice activists have to demand that. The other thing that's true and is that the thing that Latino community needs to emphasize, just so this administration doesn't forget, that the kinds of programs that benefit the Latino community are actually going to benefit other communities as well. So it's not as though you have to choose one community over another. If you design a program that actually produces benefits for the Latino community that we've been talking about, especially the environmental justice part of the Latino community, that's going to produce broad benefits. And we need to remind the administration of that. And we're not going away.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Thank you. We're coming to an end of the hour, so I really want to thank you all for your expertise and especially for the amazing work that you are doing. It's so important and today more relevant than ever. My first question to you was, how do you feel about this moment? And I would like to share with you that as a journalist that have been covering the climate crisis for the past 2 decades, I could not be more hopeful to see how change is happening all around us, how governments are committing and working together and rebuilding trust and cooperation, how companies are getting on board and changing the way they produce their products, how local governments and cities are transforming the way that we live. And especially excited to see how many people, you and me, were opening our eyes to see the need of change, that we need to see that we need to rebuild this relationship that we have with nature, and that we have the power to create a way of life where we respect our planet, where we include everyone, and where we live in a sustainable way. All of this is possible, and I could not be more excited to be part of this moment in history. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Martinez, Dr. Torres, thank you, Mr. Carbonell, and thank you, LULAC and EDF and Corazon Latino for creating this platform for all of us to have this very important conversation. I hope that you have a wonderful week, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.